Life's gonna lift him again.
To start off, I bet many of you, even the ones from Bakersfield, don't know that Buck Owens' first name was actually Alvis. You can look it up. It was Alvis Edgar Owens Jr. And you probably didn't know there's a famous English car called the Alvis. Here's a picture. Check out that logo, huh? But the best part is what the word Alvis actually means. Turns out it's a Scandinavian word that means all wise. Huh, well how about that? I wonder if Buck knew what his real first name meant. I bet his dad knew the score. So this show isn't about Alvis Buck Owens, no. And it isn't about the Alvis vintage car either, even though we will be talking quite a bit about cars. I guess you could call this an Alvis car because this is my car and my name is Mark Alvis. But that's not the most important thing. Not that long ago, we were much more in touch with the natural world. Most of us had our hands in the soil on a daily basis. We understood that our food and our survival were directly attached, and we greatly respected that knowledge. We knew that if it didn't rain, the crops would fail, and that if it rained too much, our homes would float away. No one needed to tell us. We lived in connection with nature. While the events of the past 100 years have caused us bit by bit to become consciously detached from nature, we have at the same time become ever more enamored of our own ingenuity. Fortunately, there's a part of us that remains subconsciously attached. This part craves contact with nature and seeks it out even if it comes in an artificial package, even if it costs some their lives. Though we have lost much of our ability to have a conversation with the planet, we have lived as part of nature for most of our time here on Earth. So when we see a polluted river or a dying puffin, we still feel the pain of the earth. This is true even if you have no first-hand knowledge of the damage climate change is causing. We innately understand that when we poison the air, the soil, and the water, we are killing part of ourselves, and we feel real pain. Some people are afflicted by what is known as seasonal depression disorder, becoming depressed when the weather turns cold and dark. Climate change depression is similar, but not limited to the seasons. The anxiety of living with the imminent threat of fire or flood, or worse, the real-life experience of losing a loved one or home, the unending stream of pictures showing suffering or dying animals, affects everyone on the planet, whether we are conscious of it or not, whether we understand the science of what's happening or not. We all sense something is very, very wrong. This is because climate change is not something you get to choose to believe. It is the unintended consequence of all the activities we do that directly or indirectly put more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. In the natural world, of which we are part, everything is connected. As climate change is worldwide, everyone on the planet is affected. For the people living at or near sea level, and in the polar regions, massive changes have already occurred. Climate change depression affects everyone. It is not a mind over matter kind of thing. Celeste was hesitant when I first asked her to do an interview because she thought she didn't know enough about climate change. When we finally did the interview, COVID had been going for 5 months, and I don't think anyone was working harder than the therapists were. If COVID has benefited us in any way, it is in that we now know we need to face our own psychology to deal with crisis. We need to talk about climate change.
Our earliest attachment relationships define who we are and define how the world is. I mean, it's the most important thing. I just used your phrase. So your early attachment figures, usually your parents, primarily your mom initially, tells you that you are valuable when mom responds to you, tells you that you're important when mom takes care of you, tells you that the world is a relatively safe place when, you know, your diaper is dirty and mom comes to change it, when you're hungry and mom comes to feed you. That defines the entire scope in that window of when you're figuring out who you are in the world and who the world is to you, about how important you are and how safe the world is. Why are we as Americans disconnected? We have this beautiful, fabulous, infallible system that kind of makes America what America is, for good and for bad. You know, I mean, I find that with individuals, usually people's best, strongest, most positive, amazing qualities, you know, there's a flip side of the coin. And it winds up, you know, if someone is very driven, sometimes they can be overly ambitious, right? If someone's really laid back, that can, on the flip side, is lazy. And so we have these beautiful values in our culture of rugged individualism, of capitalism, of freedom, of independence. I mean, it's what our country was founded on, which is beautiful. The flip side of that, where it can go wonky and can go negative, is where we really feel like it's just about us, where we lose our connectedness. And also, our country's really young. I think lots of other countries that have been around for a lot longer, they come from roots of indigenous people. They come from roots of cultures that came up from depending on the earth and relying on the earth and being really connected to their environment. Our country's super young. And we came into this, you know, this breadbasket. So our culture is really young. And our culture is really based on sort of, leave us alone. We're going to do our own thing. Don't tell me what to do. We have all this freedom to do whatever we want with it, which is, again, part of the beauty of being Americans. The flip side of that is we can err on the side of being disconnected from history, disconnected from culture, disconnected from family. Like, people left their families to come here, disconnected from the earth. So I think that's a big piece. And I also think the nature of capitalism, well, I think it's an amazing system that, you know, there are some glass ceilings, obviously, but there's also do whatever you want to do. It can tend toward egocentrism. It can tend toward lack of consideration for other people, for the environment, for who we harm on our climb up the ladder. And I think when we're faced with trauma, when we're faced with bad stuff that we can't control, so there are all kinds of different defense mechanisms that can come into play. Denial, repression, projection. For people who are dialed in enough to really have an emotional response to it, becomes this kind of trauma thing where it's fight, flight, or freeze. You know, do we get paralyzed and we go, I don't know what to do, I can't do anything, it feels insurmountable. Yeah. Do we fight it and go, you know, or do we run away and say, oh, it's not a thing, like not going there, la, 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 whistling in the dark. There's research on PTSD, largely based on veterans, and also the school bus kidnapping that happened decades ago right here in the Valley. But the bus was hijacked, and so they got to study the effects of this trauma on kids. Okay. So they did a longitudinal study. And what they have found from that study, that was the first longitudinal study on PTSD. And then since then, the government's been great with trying to research more about PTSD with veterans. Right. And what they have found is that people on the bus who tried to do something had much, much lower residual symptoms than folks who didn't. So the people who froze, the people who, you know, tried to escape in one way or the other, had the intrusive thoughts, the recurring nightmares, the hypervigilance, you know, yada, feelings of guilt and blah, blah, blah. But the folks who actually showed up and tried to do something, their PTSD symptoms were significantly less severe. Same thing with veterans. PTSD with veterans, when folks have tried to do what they can, when they are in that fight mode, when they are in that, like, what can we do mode, they have significantly less negative residual, like PTSD symptoms. That's not a value judgment. That's not we are wired differently for whatever reason, whether it's genetic, whether it's from our family systems. In crisis, it's not a moral choice, right? Like, we don't say, I can fight, flight, or flee. Like, what am I gonna do? So it's not saying the people who don't fight are like worse people or not as noble or whatever. I'm just saying the research does tend to indicate that folks who respond to try to fix it and change it actually fare much better personally. When people encounter something that stirs up feelings, when we shove the feelings down, they always come out. They always come out in ways that we are not aware of, in ways that we don't have control over, in ways and places that we have no idea, like, why is this happening? What's going on? I don't understand it. Whereas when we acknowledge our feelings, when it becomes implicit and it's shoved down, it like burrows out in ways, right? It's part of why therapy works, is by making the implicit explicit and dealing with the feelings and dealing with the scary things that are out there and dealing with the trauma and the PTSD and the, like, oh my gosh, what's happening with my family, my marriage, my children, the planet, the government, COVID, what have you. Then we can air it out and we can process through it and it dissipates. My working hypothesis is that if the world were a perfect place, we wouldn't need therapists. If we had really healthy relationships with our partners, with our parents, with our peers, that we would have a safe space to be able to, like, dig deep and throw out those really vulnerable, really authentic, even like shame impacted places, and bounce that off another person who would meet us with acceptance and input and maybe suggestions and whatever. But I do, I mean, and that's a hard thing to say because that almost implies that people who are in therapy are messed up because they don't have that support system. But honestly, I don't know anyone who grew up with even a family that's safe enough to do that with, much less this. It's just our culture. We don't live in a perfect world. So go to therapy, because we all need it. I love therapy. When we have gone through like grief and mourning, it's powerful just to have a witness. There's just something about the way we're wired. We are not wired. And there's so many studies, there's so much research behind this. We are not wired to go through life alone. Hospice centers, they're so genius with this. You just have people come in, bring you a cup of coffee, hold your hand, and go like, this is hard. Like, you've been there with them. Like, and that's sometimes all we need, but we're wired for connection. I believe that we all have this internal compass that points us toward where we need to go, this internal truth. And I didn't come up with this. Like, I didn't even believe this. This wasn't something I subscribed to or bought into, but just in being a therapist, I've just seen it over and over and over and over and over again. When I've seen people come in with overbearing parents or overbearing partners or low self-esteem or coming from abuse or trauma or what have you, and they're like, tell me what to do. And that just rubbed me the wrong way as a new therapist, right? And so I was like, well, let's talk about how you feel. Like, what do you think you need to do? And it's a weird, okay, so this is a little secret. Maybe we don't want to actually put this on the air because it's a little secret. So
Turn it off.
no, keep it on. We can edit it out. But it's like, so what do you feel like you need to do? And people are like, I have no idea. And I'm like, well, if you did, have an idea, if you did know what you needed to do, what do you think it would be? And they're like, well, I think I need to get out of this relationship. Or like, their knee-jerk reaction is, I don't know. I have no idea. But when it's expanded to the level of like, how about you imagine, right? How about you imagine if you did know, what would that look like? People know. I mean, I've been astounded. I wasn't taught this in grad school. I didn't read this in a book, but I just see over and over and over again. And when people listen to that, and at first I'm like, oh no, should I tell them to do what they think they should do or not? Should I be telling them what I think, new therapist. But I was just like, hey, my mission is to make myself obsolete, right?
Yeah.
I don't want my clients to need me forever. Yeah. I want them to not need me. And so I don't want them to depend on me to tell them what they should do or whatever. So I'm kind of hashing out all those values in my head. And I'm sort of like, so what do you think? And I find we have culturally, probably in other cultures too, but at least in this culture, predominantly, been trained not to listen to our compass and not to trust our compass. Yeah. So we don't listen. And so I say, so what do you feel like you need to do? I have no idea. We don't know how to listen. But then when I say, well, if you did have an idea, what do you think it would be? I need to take a step back, or you need to just show up and forgive and show up more love. Like people know. Yeah. And then so trusting. So what would it be like to do that? And then they do it and it freaking works. That's the weird thing. So that's what sold me. I was like, I don't know about this. I didn't learn this in grad school. What if I encourage people to listen to their own compass, and they do, and it winds up 100% of the time working. So your question was talk therapy. So a huge piece of talk therapy for me is validating that your compass is working, validating that you can listen to yourself and you can trust yourself, validating that you don't need to derive your self-worth or your belief system based on what anybody else says. I mean, people in and of themselves know we're screwing up the environment. We know that. And they can reference this and reference that or not think about it or whatever. But it's one of those things always under the surface. And I do think that we all live with this awareness. We know, you see smog, right? You hear, oil spills. You hear global warming, right? We used to hear ozone layer. It's a little bit better now, whatever. Like we see clear cutting. You can see it. You drive past those trees. You drive past again, there's no trees. Like that is there. So what I loved about the Drawdown book is that when I think about climate change, environmental issues, it feels like we've sucked, we failed, we sucked, we failed. It's the same, like, why did you do that? Why didn't you do that? It's just like, you just have to like put a loser on my forehead. Like that doesn't feel redemptive. Even, parenting my kids, I remember reading something that was super powerful. That's like, give the kids an opportunity to redeem themselves. It's like, you don't punish them for doing something bad, saying like you're bad. Like you have another opportunity to do something better. Like you want to encourage that different that you're looking for. And I love Drawdown because it was exactly that thing. I get we as humans have screwed things up. Like I get we as Americans have been a huge part of the problem, but I love the Drawdown book because it was the invitation for like redemption. It was the invitation. It was like boiling it down, getting the hay out of the loft so the horses can eat it. This is what we can do to make things better. I think women have always been at the forefront of defending the underdogs, defending the environment. Like I remember when I was with the Pergs, my bosses were women, the directors were women, most of the people who worked there were women. There is this sense of like this maternal, this nurturing caretaking, compassionate side of women. My whole life, I thought the most important thing was truth. That was my bullseye for various reasons. My most important thing was truth, and like fidelity to the truth, and honesty and integrity with the truth. And it was just a couple years ago that I sort of had this revelation that was like, hey, Celeste, actually love is the most important thing. And truth, it's not love v truth. It's truth is subsumed within love, but love is the most important thing. And that was a few years ago. But, you had asked me that question the other day, what's the most important thing? So I was running this morning and I thought, what's the most important thing to me right now? And I thought, like, reducing or healing and not contributing to suffering, mitigating suffering, right? Not creating any more suffering, doing what I can to be a healing force in suffering. And I was like, that's dumb. Like, how about you're a force for good rather than just trying to get from negative up to zero? Like, and I literally really had this moment. I really had this transformative moment when it's like, okay, if I'm not trying to get up, because that's what I do, right? Talk to people who are hurting and whatever, like, but I also talk to fabulous people and help them, walk with them through becoming more fabulous. And so I went like, love is the most important thing. And love does not survive in a vacuum. I mean, love by definition implies a relationship. There is something about how we're made. And I think this is just, I remember being challenged by this years ago. And, when we come with moments of revelation, sometimes we forget until we circle back around. But there is so much life and joy and freedom and power in seeing what we can contribute to the stream of life, as opposed to seeing what we can draw out of it. And I feel like capitalistic culture tends to say tends to say, what can I get out of this? And I think it's a lie. What I have found true for myself and what I've seen true in my clients is that the freedom, the joy, the peace, kind of the transcendence comes when we shift and we seek to contribute what we can contribute into the river of life. That's the idea, that if we can get enough and take enough, we will be happy. That's a lie. It's a deception. It does not work. Those people are not happy. To the degree that I've done that, I have not been happy. To the degree that I say, I'm going to see what I can give, what I can throw out there, what I can contribute. That is where I find my joy. And there's something wonky in our culture where we really think that, it's about take advantage of this, capitalize on that, see what you can get out of this, that, and the other. Forget who you're hurting, forget what you're, just try to get ahead, or dog eat dog, rat race, whatever. That will never bring happiness, ever. It's not how we're wired. We are wired for global survival. And when we are connected to each other, to the planet, to spirit, when we are seeing what we can contribute to the river of life, that's where we find peace. That's where we find purpose. That's where we find joy. That's where we find transcendence and happiness. We can look ourselves in the mirror and say, I love you. You are awesome. Yeah. And even if you had a crappy day, you're still awesome.
When I first moved into this house, it needed a new water heater, and I put one in. I've lived here for about 20 years, and it was time to put another new water heater in, and we did. We put this in about 2 months ago. This is a heat pump water heater, and it works completely differently than the gas-fired water heater that I used to have. Most people in California still use gas to heat water, and it is becoming more and more expensive to heat with gas, and also we want to stop burning gas because it's making obviously more CO2. The other advantage of using a heat pump water heater, an electric water heater, is that if you do have solar on your house, you can power your water heater, you can heat your water with solar power, which makes total sense. The other part of that people haven't really quite figured out yet is that one of the drawbacks of solar energy is that we actually make too much at the wrong time. So we need to figure out ways to store that energy. And oddly, you could think of the heat pump water heater using solar energy as a energy storage system. It's relatively easy to figure out. So you're making solar electric power, right? There's solar panels on the roof, and it's using that electricity to turn the heat pump water heater on, and now it's heating the water. So that energy is being transferred. It turns from electric energy into heat, which is then stored in the water heater tank to be used later. So it's like a heat storage system. So like many things, water heaters have become a little bit more technical. This one is called a heat pump water heater, and it makes a little bit more noise than you're used to, but by and large it's way more efficient, and I think you'll be much happier using a heat pump water heater than a regular gas-fired water heater.